I've always loved camping. The silence, the solitude. It's the perfect escape. So when my best friend, Kyle, invited me on a weekend trip to a remote lake in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. We'd been camping together for years, and this was supposed to be just another adventure. But something about that lake. I don't think I'll ever go back. We reached the lake just before sunset. It was a place Kyle had discovered on a solo trip the year before. He said he'd never seen another person there, which was exactly what we were looking for. The water was still, like glass, and the trees around it were dense, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy overhead. The air was cool, almost too cool for early autumn, but it felt refreshing after the long hike. As we set up camp, I noticed something strange. The lake was completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to the isolation. Maybe it was just too far from civilization for wildlife to feel comfortable. Kyle didn't seem bothered, so I pushed the unease to the back of my mind and focused on building a fire. We spent the evening drinking beers and swapping stories, laughing and reminiscing about old times. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow across the lake, I'd almost forgotten about the silence. Almost. It wasn't until we settled into our tents that night that things started to feel wrong. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the canvas of the tent, I realized just how unnatural the silence was. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. There was no sound of wind, no rustle of fabric, no distant howl of a coyote. Just nothing. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, shuffling footsteps, like someone walking barefoot through the dirt. I lay there for a moment, groggy and disoriented, listening. Kyle. Maybe he'd gotten up to pee, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled around the tent, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was inspecting the campsite. "Kyle," I whispered, sitting up and unzipping the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The fire had long since died, leaving the camp in complete darkness. I strained my eyes, trying to see something, anything, but the blackness was suffocating. I couldn't even see Kyle's tent. The footsteps continued, moving away from my tent, toward the lake. I didn't know what compelled me to follow them, but before I knew it, I was out of my tent, barefoot and cold, stumbling toward the shore. I called out again, louder this time. "Kyle?" No answer, just that same, slow shuffling sound, now coming from the edge of the water. I approached the lake cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The water, which had been perfectly still earlier, now seemed to ripple, though there was no wind. I stopped a few feet from the shore, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing waist deep in the water, its back to me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its skin was pale, almost glowing in the faint moonlight. I couldn't see its face, but I could hear it breathing. Raspy, shallow breaths, like it was struggling for air. "Kyle!" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, as if it hadn't heard me. I took a step closer, my pulse racing, when suddenly it began to move. Slowly, it turned toward me, and as it did, my stomach dropped. It wasn't Kyle. The thing's face, if you could even call it that, was a grotesque mass of pale skin, stretched too tight over its skull. Its eyes were black, hollow pits, and its mouth hung open, revealing a gaping void where its teeth should have been. I stumbled back, my mind reeling with terror. The thing took a step toward me, its feet dragging through the water with that same shuffling sound I'd heard earlier. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, just as it reached the shore, it stopped. It stared at me with those empty, soulless eyes, its mouth twitching as if it were trying to speak. But no words came out, just a low, guttural moan that sent chills down my spine. I don't remember running back to my tent. I don't remember grabbing my gear or shaking Kyle awake. The next thing I knew, we were sprinting through the woods, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled over rocks and tree roots. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Breathless and shaking, we drove back to town in silence, neither of us daring to speak about what we'd seen. I haven't spoken to Kyle since that night. He never mentioned the lake again, and I've done my best to forget it ever happened. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same shuffling sound outside my window, and I wonder if it followed us. When I agreed to spend a week in a remote cabin in the woods, I thought it would be peaceful. My life had been chaotic lately, and I needed a break. A friend of mine owned the cabin and assured me it was the perfect place to unwind. "You'll love it," he said. "No neighbors, no noise, just you and nature." He wasn't wrong about the isolation. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, hidden away in a dense forest, with no cell service and barely any road leading up to it. That first day, it felt like paradise. Just the kind of quiet I'd been craving. But by the third day, the isolation began to feel more like a prison. The weather turned on me. Rain, relentless and heavy, pounded the roof day and night. I couldn't leave the cabin without getting drenched, so I spent most of my time reading or staring out the window, watching the rain blur the line between forest and sky. It was on the fourth night that things started to get strange. I was lying in bed, listening to the rain, when I heard it, a knock at the door. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, in the dead of night? But there it was again, a slow, deliberate knock, louder this time. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer, just the sound of rain and wind against the cabin. I peered through the small window beside the door, expecting to see, I don't know, maybe a lost hiker or something. But there was no one there, just the empty porch, slick with rainwater. For a moment, I considered opening the door, but something held me back. Instead, I locked it and retreated to my bedroom, telling myself it was just the wind. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. But the knocking didn't return. The next morning, I woke up to find muddy footprints on the porch. They were large, barefoot, and led from the edge of the forest to the front door, and then back into the trees. My stomach turned as I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. No one had any business being out here, especially not barefoot in the rain. I considered packing up and leaving, but the road had turned to mud from the constant rain, and my car wouldn't make it far. So I convinced myself it was just a prank, maybe some local kids messing with me. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. No one knew I was here. That night, the knocking came again. I was in the kitchen washing up after dinner when I heard it. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like someone was using their whole fist to pound on the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest knife and stormed to the door, throwing it open, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there. But again, there was nothing. No one. The rain was still pouring, the wind howling through the trees, but the porch was empty. I stepped outside, gripping the knife tightly, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. And then I saw him. At the edge of the forest, just barely visible through the sheets of rain, stood a man, He was tall, too tall, with his head slightly bowed, as if he were watching me from under his brow. His clothes were old, tattered, and his skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. I called out to him, demanding to know who he was, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering something, and then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door, shut, and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, the knife still in my hand, waiting for the knocking to come again. It didn't. But the next morning, the footprints were back, leading from the forest to the door and then away again. I left the cabin that day. I didn't care about the mud or the rain. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping, until I was back in town, back in the safety of civilization. I don't know who or what that man was, but sometimes, when it rains, I still hear the knocking. Slow, deliberate, like it's waiting for me to open the door.